Hey everyone, today we are going to talk about the Great Depression, which was a huge economic event that happens in the late 1920s and sort of really impacts those interwar years. So questions to consider as we move through this video. What was the world's economy like after World War I? What are the causes of the Great Depression? How did countries try to recover during the Great Depression? And then what is the New Deal? On this slide, you will see all of the key terms. Please make sure you keep an eye out for these throughout the video. Remember, they are going to be in blue, bold, and underlined text. So it's really important to note that after the war, after World War I, countries all over the world sort of struggled to recover economically. War is very, very expensive. And especially with World War I, which is a total war, everyone's focus is on the war. You're not really thinking about civilian life. Everything is going toward the war effort. And once that war is over, we are going to see that countries around the world are really, really struggling to recover. So European nations, where a lot of this fighting was happening, they are rebuilding their economies. Nearly every major European country is bankrupt at the end of World War I. Again, all of countries' revenues, all of their taxes are going toward the war effort. And so once that war is over, the economies are going to sort of struggle to recover. And really, some of the only countries that come out of the war in better financial shape are the United States and Japan. And the United States provides loans to many European countries to help them recover. The United States sort of is the backbone of the world economy, just in terms of how much assistance they are providing, especially to Europe. And what we're going to see is the world sort of experiences an economic recession after World War I. And an economic recession is a period of temporary economic decline where trade and industrial activity are reduced. So economies were sort of built up to support the war effort. Now that there is no war, we start to see economies scale back. And so we see sort of all over the world, countries that had been at war are sort of struggling to sort of pull back production needed for the war effort. And really, American economic prosperity largely sustains the world economy at this point. Economic recovery throughout the world after World War I is reliant on a strong U.S. economy. So while most parts of the world are really struggling at this time, I want us to focus a little bit on Germany. As a reminder, Germany was forced to accept the Treaty of Versailles, which not only blamed them for the war in its entirety, but also assigned them large reparations to pay the Allied powers. And so Germany's money problems start in World War I. Most of the time, you raise taxes to help fund a war, but Germany instead decided to just print money to pay expenses. So rather than putting the burden of funding the war on its citizens, the German government just decides to print as much money as they need. And what this does is it causes high inflation. And inflation is when sort of the average price of goods increases over a period of time. So we sort of can think of this situation as Germany is printing more and more money. And when you print more and more money, that money has less value because there is more of it. So $1, the value of that dollar sort of changes if there are more dollars in circulation. So when money loses its value, it means it takes more money to pay for things. So goods like bread and other food products end up costing more. So if a loaf of bread costs $1 when you have sort of only some money in circulation, it might end up costing like $5 or $6 if you have lots and lots of money printed and in circulation for use in a country, I should say. And then because goods cost more, you end up with more money, and it's just sort of this cycle. And so when Germany has to start paying reparations in 1921, they again turn to this, let's just print as much money as we need in order to pay these reparations. And the German currency basically becomes worthless because there's so much money in circulation. Going back to that idea of a loaf of bread, there are pictures of German citizens with wheelbarrows full of money going to the grocery store because German money is basically worthless at this point. There are pictures of German citizens burning that money to start fires in their homes to keep warm, because that is about as worthless as that German money is. And so what we're going to see is Germany is really struggling financially. And so the Dawes Plan sort of comes into effect to help slow down that inflation, create a new structure for reparation payments to sort of help Germany recover financially. Because at this point, they are really struggling. And so it basically provides Germany with a $200 million loan from American banks to help stabilize their economy and currency. And it also restructures Germany's debt that they have to pay back to Britain and France, who then likewise pay back the United States. So again, this really demonstrates the fact that the United States is really kind of holding the world economy together since they sort of come out of World War I in a pretty good spot. Now, this whole video is about the Great Depression, and the Great Depression is sort of the worst long-term downturn in economic activity in the history of the industrialized world. The industrialized world meaning those countries that had industrialized first. So Europe, the United States. So when we think of the Great Depression, we really want to think of the industrialized world. Not that it doesn't have an impact on the rest of the world, but it very clearly impacts the industrialized world sort of from the outset. And this Great Depression, we sort of characterize it from lasting from October of 1929 until the outbreak of World War II, roughly 10 years later. So the long-term causes of the Great Depression sort of exposes a lot of the general weaknesses in the world's economies. So again, there is high World War I debt. We also start to see that countries, in order to protect their economies, start to pass various tariff or tax policies that sort of promote their citizens from buying their goods. So for example, the United States is going to pass tariffs that promote buying American goods, that make European goods way more expensive than American goods. We're going to see that there is a lot of agricultural overproduction, and so a lot of those food products are sort of flooding the market. We see that there's a low value of world currencies. So a lot of currencies around the world are sort of valued very low. So similar to what we sort of see in Germany. Disrupted trade policies, and then finally sort of speculation or uncertain investments. So overall, the Great Depression, there were lots of these long-term causes that all sort of came together, but the US stock market crash is really what sort of sparked the Great Depression. Remember, the United States at this point is really sort of holding the world's economy together. They're providing loans to Europe. They are sort of making sure that Europe is able to recover financially from this war. And when the stock market crashes, the United States goes into a depression, which then in turn leads to a worldwide economic catastrophe. So when the stock market crashes in October of 1929, we are going to see that it has a profound impact on the world. And we will see that the United States economy was sort of ripe for depression. There's an incredibly uneven distribution of wealth. The wealthiest Americans have more money than the sort of bottom rungs of society in the United States. There is major overproduction by businesses and in the agricultural section. And we're also seeing that consumers are buying less. So we're overproducing goods and services, but people are buying less. And the United States' struggles are going to have a very big impact on the world. So how does this affect the global economies? So the United States sort of starts trying to recover from the stock market crash by passing a lot of taxes and tariffs that will sort of protect U.S. Consumer interests. So the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act established the highest protective tariff in United States history, and it was designed to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition. So it basically makes other goods and services from other countries so expensive that people have to buy American. But this tariff sort of starts off what can only be described as a tariff war. Other countries who sort of see what the United States is doing take steps to do the same thing, so making it more difficult for American goods to be sold outside of the country. And we're going to see that international trade as a result drops 65%. So countries are sort of taking steps to promote their goods and services rather than trading with other countries. We're going to see personal income, tax revenue, business profits, foreign exports, consumer prices. All of those things drop significantly. Unemployment rates are huge. Banks are failing, meaning people are losing their life savings. And then industry-heavy cities around the world are sort of hit the hardest because we are going to see industrial production decline. So the Great Depression has a tremendous impact around the world, and sort of really people sort of really struggle to survive this economic depression. So as we can see here, we've got a couple of charts that sort of show unemployment rate and world trade. So in 1928, so the year before the Great Depression starts, we see that unemployment rates for Great Britain, Germany, and the United States are sort of anywhere between maybe 5 and maybe like 11%. But then once the stock market crashes, once this Great Depression hits, we see unemployment rates soar as we move into the 1930s. We see in 1932, Germany has an unemployment rate of 30%. The United States and Great Britain have unemployment rates right under 25%. And we're going to see that this unemployment rate sort of has a huge impact on quality of life for citizens of these countries. We also see in this world trade graph, we see how steadily world imports and exports begin to drop. We see that they drop from roughly $35 billion before the crash in 1929, but 4 years later, they're only around a little more than 10 billion. So that has a significant impact on the economies around the world. How does the world begin to recover from such a catastrophic economic event? And the United States is sort of the first country that begins to figure out how to recover from this depression. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who becomes president in 1933, he proposes a set of policies to help sort of alleviate a lot of these problems brought on by the Great Depression. He truly believes that government spending would help create jobs and start a recovery, and he is right. This New Deal does get Americans back to work, does sort of help the economy begin to recover. We see that this New Deal creates lots of new government agencies that give help to businesses and farms. And we also see that there are large amounts of public money that are spent on welfare and relief programs. And we see a lot of these welfare and relief programs still today. Social Security is actually proposed as as part of the New Deal, and it is something that millions upon millions of Americans still rely on today, and it's something that taxpayers still pay into, and that is a New Deal program. So, impact of the Great Depression around the world. Again, we are going to see that the Great Depression impacts a lot more industrialized nations and colonies of industrialized nations, because those economies were sort of so dependent on industry. And so countries that are affected greatly include the United States, Europe, African colonies, and Latin America. So the United States sort of sets off this Great Depression with the stock market crash, which sort of really exposed some weaknesses in the United States economy. Europe really relied on American loans to fuel their economy after World War I. So when the United States struggled, in turn, Europe struggles. And African colonies who were ruled by European nations, they are also affected. We see that there are a sharp fall in prices, and there's a steep decline in exports to Europe. So those African colonies also struggle during the Great Depression. Latin America, again, there's a lot of U.S. investment in Latin America at this time, and when the United States sort of falls, a lot of other dominoes fall as well. So we see that in Latin America, it sort of has a pretty big impact, but it also sort of leads those area governments to start to develop new local industries and then expand consumption and production to try to get away from a lot of that American investment. And then there are a couple of countries that are sort of not terribly affected, who are maybe affected just a little bit. Japan sort of takes early steps to offset the depression. They sort of move to devalue some of their currency to protect it. China is largely unaffected. They rely on the silver standard versus the gold standard at this point, and they are able to sort of avoid a lot of these Great Depression issues. And then finally, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union as a command economy or a planned economy, there's sort of little interaction with international trade at this point. And so the Soviet Union sort of is not terribly affected because they are not sort of interacting economically with the rest of the world. So what we're going to see in Europe and in Latin America is that the struggles with the economy are going to open up a place for dictatorship. So a lot of democracies that have been established in Latin America, in Europe by the 1920s, those economic struggles are going to open up space for authoritative dictatorship. Most notably, we are going to see Adolf Hitler in Germany. We are going to see Mussolini in Italy. So a lot of these countries that had been democracies struggle in the Great Depression, and then ultimately we start to see a change in government and power. So some key takeaways from the Great Depression. Most of the world's economies were negatively affected by World War I, save for the United States and Japan. The Great Depression was sort of a long time coming. There were a lot of long-term causes, including war debt and overproduction and a low value of currencies, but it was ultimately sort of sparked by the U.S. stock market crash in 1929. And we're also going to see that the Great Depression and the economic struggles in many parts of the world are going to contribute to the rise of authoritative dictatorships. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you all in class. Take care.